Hi, this is Scott from the Polley Music Library. You're probably already aware of the Read for Change, Read Woke Reading Challenge happening now through January 31st at Lincoln City Libraries. If you're not, this is the Winter Reading Challenge for the library this season, and you can get more information on the challenge by heading to this website, lincolnlibraries.org/readwoke, W-O-K-E, 2021. This is part of a reading challenge that many library systems around the country are taking place in, with hopes that readers might come into contact with books that challenge a social norm, give voice to the voiceless, provide information about a group that has been disenfranchised, seek to challenge the status quo, or have a protagonist from an underrepresented or oppressed group. You might not first think of the Polley Music Library as a place to find books for this Read for Change challenge, but we actually have a lot of books that might help provide insight along these lines. Like other areas of cultural endeavor, the world of music is a dynamic one, full of participants from all kinds of cultures and backgrounds, and we have lots of books here in Polley that highlight their unique musical paths. In this video, I'm going to briefly highlight just 15 of them that you might like if you want to read about musical issues while also taking place in the challenge. What Are You Doing Here? A Black Woman's Life and Liberation in Heavy Metal by Lena Dawes. Music 781.66, Dawes, Lena. What Are You Doing Here addresses racism and sexism in heavy metal, punk, and hardcore music scenes, from the perspective of a black woman who is both a longtime fan of the music and a music critic who has written about these scenes for most of her career. Dawes switches between sharing her own perspective and interviewing lots of other women of color who have been lifelong fans of this music or musicians themselves. The KarlMuck Scandal, Classical Music and Xenophobia in World War I America by Melissa Burridge. Music 780.92, Muck. Immigrants often face difficulties as newcomers in new lands, and times of war often raise negative suspicions of those newcomers to new heights. In the KarlMuck Scandal, you'll learn about the story of Karl Muck, who was once the esteemed German-born conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. During World War I, when anti-German sentiments were crossing the United States, his patriotism was called into question, and he was forced into internment by the government. For those of you who read the 2016 One Book, One Nebraska selection, The Meaning of Names, by Karen Gedert Shoemaker, you'll find some of the themes of this book familiar. Silenced by Sound, The Music Meritocracy Myth by Ian Brennan. Music 780.1, BRE. The notion of world music as a genre has a complicated cultural history. On the positive side, the record industry makes it possible to distribute recordings made virtually anywhere on the globe to new audiences, which has allowed listeners to hear music from remote, faraway lands from the comfort of home. But on the negative side, the marketing of music from these remote lands has often involved a certain othering process, relegating non-Western musics of the world to the singular world music section of places like record stores. As these once obscure musical approaches spread to the West through recordings, many Western musicians also borrowed from these styles to create their own forms of world music. And whether that process fundamentally represents a celebration of musical diversity or an opportunity for exploitation is a valid question for debate. American music producer Ian Brennan, whose work has included field recording and production for musicians from international, non-Western musical traditions, offers his observations regarding how these issues continue to influence the music we hear. Brennan highlights mostly unheralded musicians from around the world, observes how we often miss out on these artists. Quote, "If you toss a dart at a map of the world, you are most likely to hit a country that is underrepresented or entirely unrepresented in international media," end quote, and critiques our willingness to accept relatively mediocre work from our Western pop stars simply because of their celebrity status. God Save the Queens, The Essential History of Women in Hip-Hop by Kathy Ian Doley. Music 781.66. This is a well-written history of women in hip-hop that goes back to the foundational days of the genre and takes us right up to the present. Doley herself has been a journalist involved with hip-hop for most of her career, dating back to 1999, and has written for magazines like Vibe and The Source, in addition to Rolling Stone, Billboard, and lots of hip-hop focused websites. She uses her extensive experience in the hip-hop industry to create a unique narrative structure for this book. Sometimes she's drawing from her personal experiences. Sometimes she's writing like an historian. And sometimes she weaves in dialogue from her own interactions with hip-hop stars of the aughts and teens. The book breaks away with little interlude sections that paint individual stories too, working almost like the skits one finds on a lot of hip-hop albums. It's a very clever and readable structure, and even if you don't have a long history with hip-hop yourself, I think you'll find this book a lot of fun to read. The book's introduction tells a fascinating story from the very origins of hip-hop, from a perspective that I hadn't considered before. While it's pretty well known that DJ Kool Herc's Party in 1973 laid some serious groundwork for the kind of vibe and musical approach hip-hop formed around, Wendoli notes that Kool Herc's sister Cindy was the real organizer behind the party, and handled ticket sales at the door. Throughout the history of hip-hop, we find that women are an important part of the development of the scene. Gay Gorilla, Julius Eastman and His Music by Mary Jane Leach. Music 780.92, Eastman. Julius Eastman was a composer and singer whose work has mostly languished in obscurity since his death in 1990. As a composer, Eastman was known as a bit of a provocateur in the East Coast new music scenes of the 1970s and 80s. As interesting as his music was, and is, his choices of titles sometimes led to controversies, causing the titles of his works to be left off concert programs. Truth be told, he remains ahead of his time in that regard. We can't say the names of several of his works on the radio or print them in a newspaper over 40 years after their composition either. But there is far more to the work of Julius Eastman than pure provocation, and what provocation there is embedded in his works seems very prescient toward contemporary discussions happening in the arts and socio-political circles. As a gay black man working in a mostly straight white environment and community, Eastman didn't hide his struggles to find peace in a society that often seemed to reject him and those like him. As the decades have passed and we continue to wrestle with these issues as a society, perhaps it's no surprise that there is a resurgence in interest in Eastman's music in the last decade, including performances, retrospective recordings, and now this first book that looks critically at his work, Gay Gorilla, Julius Eastman and His Music. Hip-Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity and Hip-Hop in Indigenous North America by Kyle Mays, Music 781.6293 MAY. A generation of indigenous youth have adopted aspects of hip-hop culture to help tell their story and own their culture. This book is a great first look at this powerful cultural and musical movement, exploring aspects of what led to this kind of cultural remix and where it's going. It's a fairly academic read, but there are some great interviews and discussion included here too. David Bowie Made Me Gay, 100 Years of LGBT Music by Daryl Bullock, Music 780.86 BUL. The provocative title draws you in, and this book ends up being a very entertaining tour of LGBTQ+ musicians in popular music of the last 100 years or so, starting back with Tony Jackson in 1910's New Orleans. It's a large, sprawling book, dipping into almost any popular style of music from the last century that you can think of, and of course that ultimately should come as no surprise. Reading about how these artists lived and worked along an historical chronology is enlightening, though, as we get to see how changes in society affected their ability to work and live as themselves. Broken Beauty, Musical Modernism and the Representation of Disability by Joseph Strauss, Music 780.87 STR. This book starts with a fascinating thesis idea and expands from there, namely that modernist music, think of Schoenberg, Bartók, and Stravinsky as examples in this context, can be interpreted as representing conditions of disability, such as mobility impairment and autism. Author Joseph Strauss uses a newer sociocultural model looking at disability as a creative cultural force, and through this lens, he analyzes musical modernism as a variety of narratives associated with, or in some fashion representative of, disability. While I must admit that aspects of this theory seem a little far-fetched to this reader, it remains a thought-provoking book, and more generally gets one thinking along the lines of an inclusive musical community where non-normative minds and bodies have representation. New York Noise, Radical Jewish Music and the Downtown Scene by Tamar Barzel, Music 780.89 BAR. This book looks at the history of a unique period in New York City's so-called downtown scene, in which composer extraordinaire John Zorn coined the term radical Jewish culture to represent what he and many of his contemporaries were doing musically. Combining the most modern of avant-garde music with more traditional Jewish musical traditions, these artists and bands forged their own paths under the radical Jewish culture banner, creating incredibly unique new music that retained a palpable Jewish identity. The book documents the especially vibrant period in the mid-1990s when this scene flourished. Black Masculinity and Hip-Hop Music, Black Gay Men Who Rap by Xin-Ling Li, Music 780.86 LI. Hip-hop has at times been a difficult genre for LGBTQ+ voices to rise to the top, but recent years have seen strides toward better representation in this area. Xin-Ling Li's book takes an academic approach to the topic. This material was part of his doctoral work, exploring the spectrum of voices throughout the history of hip-hop to the present, interpretations and representations of masculinity, and how these musical movements have grown nationally and internationally. Glitter Up the Dark, How Pop Music Broke the Binary by Sasha Geffen, Music 781.66 GEF. Though it may not have been discussed in such terms in its early days, modern rock and pop music have pushed the envelope in terms of gender identity since the beginning of rock and roll. Glitter Up the Dark is a new pop music history book of sorts that looks at many genres of popular music in terms of gender transgression, from glam rock to punk to disco to techno to hip-hop. The Fierce Urgency of Now, Improvisation, Rights, and the Ethics of Co-Creation by Daniel Fishlin, A.J. Hebley, and George Lipsitz, Music 781.36 FIS. This book is a very interesting look at the art of musical improvisation as it relates to movements for social change. It's a sophisticated look at the idea of co-creation as a fundamental force, whether that's manifested through the fight for social justice or the act of taking the stage to go somewhere no group has gone before. And the book investigates the historical co-progression of jazz and the civil rights movement. The book itself is even the co-creation of three authors, trying to use the principles they're raising up within their own work. Revenge of the She-Punks by Vivian Goldman, Music 781.66 GOL. I wish more books in the Polley Music Library came with suggested listening lists for each chapter. Revenge of the She-Punks is a fantastic history of women's participation in the history of punk music, written by Vivian Goldman, herself one of the first female music journalists in the UK back in the early 70s. The book is divided into four main sections, covering the broad topics of identity, money, love, and protest. As I mentioned, each of these sections has a suggested playlist made of music by the artists who are primarily featured within the section. The coverage starts in the 70s and continues through to the present day. Feminism and the role of women in the music is of course the primary focus, but related intersectional topics from these eras are also explored. Move On Up, Chicago Soul Music and Black Cultural Power by Aaron Cohen, Music 781.66 COH. This book is an excellent history of Chicago's soul scene from the 1960s to the 1980s, which produced lots of memorable hits, but was also a powerful vehicle of black empowerment. This is a deeply researched book, but Cohen's style makes it read almost like an action novel at times. It's obvious that he's a huge fan of the art and the music, as he shares both the musical and community-building excitement behind Chicago soul. Grounds for Possible Music, on Gender, Voice, Language, and Identity, edited by Julia Eckert, Music 780 GRO. Gender, voice, language, and identity are the four core topics shared among the essays in Grounds for Possible Music. The essays in this collection mostly come from artists who work in experimental, avant-garde, contemporary classical, and sound art streams of modern music, which makes these essays particularly interesting to me because they are areas of music that tend to be more abstract to most listeners, and composers and performers for that matter. From these abstracted corners of the musical world, we find many women and non-binary artists represented here whose practices in this music help to define identity, languages familiar, new, and in development, the voices of cultural minorities breaking through, and gender reflected both at the personal level and within the communities of artists that form around the music. The essays go in many different directions, and it's hard to summarize a book full of such diverse voices, and therein lies the strength of this very intriguing book. I hope some of these books sound interesting to you, and we have even more books on hand that you might find interesting for the Read Woke Challenge, and all kinds of other music histories, biographies, sheet music, and more. Happy reading this winter, and again, you can find more information on the Lincoln City Library's Read for Change Read Woke Reading Challenge on our website at lincolnlibraries.org/READWOKE2021.